Well, hey guys, welcome back to Let's Talk About It with Jackie and Megan. Today we're back with Pastor Bryan. We had him on last week to talk about baptism, and this week we're talking about the Lord's Supper and discussing the Lutheran view versus the Catholic view and other Protestant views. For those that didn't listen to our last episode, Pastor Bryan, do you want to just give a little up, not update or brief introduction of yourself?
Sure. From last week to this week, I'm still pastor at St. Paul Lutheran
Yeah.
Church and Jesus Deaf Lutheran Church in Austin, Texas. So serving here, God be praised. It's a wonderful place to be and live with my wife, Carrie, and two of our kids are still at home here in Round Rock, just north of Austin. So come and visit when you're in Austin. Come and see us. And
Oh,
they got a website, which is just wolfmeuller.co, and there's a bunch of theology stuff up there. So
nice.
And a YouTube channel, which we will link in the description as well.
I got the
But yeah, we're
YouTubes
excited to talk
going.
about it's going.
That's good.
We're excited to talk about the Lord's Supper today, and our audience is very excited as well. So I know, just coming from my background in evangelical circles, very memorial. Jackie coming from a Catholic, very transubstantiation. I think this brings an interesting perspective than talking to a Lutheran about this. But I think as we start, would you maybe just be able to concisely, if possible, describe what the Lutheran view of real presence in the Lord's Supper is?
Sure, we can dig into it because I guess there's two approaches for the Lutheran, sandwiched between a Catholic and an evangelical, is to say, well, you're both kind of right, which would be the nice way. You could say, well, you're both wrong. But I remember, so I think the best way, this is, I hope, the Lutheran approach. Just kind of reading all of the Lutheran stuff on the Lord's Supper and all the reflection. There's a lot. And Luther wrote more about the Lord's Supper than any other topic in his whole ministry. And like that, I think, is surprising to people because it seems like the Reformation was not about the Lord's Supper, but really it was. And the basic Lutheran approach is Jesus says, "This is my body." And we say, okay. And then he says, "This is my blood poured out for you for the forgiveness of sins." And we say, okay. Okay. And that's it. And the theology that develops out of that is, well, how could this be true? And in fact, the most difficult portion of the official Lutheran doctrine, the Book of Concord, Formula of Concord, Article 8, is on the person of Christ, reflecting on the two natures united in the single person. And it's a reflection that grows out of Christ must be God and man in such a way that the words, "This is my body," can be true. So that the Christology, in fact, grows out of the confession of the reality of what Jesus is saying there. So what is it? It's the true body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, given under the bread and wine for Christians to eat and drink for the forgiveness of sins. That's the definition of the Lord's Supper. And so we would say, against the evangelicals, it's not a memorial meal. It's really the true body and blood. We would say against the Reformed, there's kind of a little slice of kind of Calvinist Reformed theology that stand between the memorial meal and the Lutheran idea, and that is the doctrine of the real presence.
Mm.
Sometimes people, even Lutherans, kind of will lazily say, well, we believe in the real presence. Well, so do the Calvinists, but they believe in the presence of the divine nature of Christ. They say the human nature is circumscribed to the right hand of the Father, which they understand as a location, and that a human nature must have a location, so that the presence in the supper is the presence of the divine nature of Jesus, and we commune on him by faith. So there's always a kind of a fight between the Lutherans and the Reformed on the supper, and there's some fun stuff in there because there were some secret Calvinists who were in there, and the Lutherans are trying to figure it out, and so they would devise questions to ask to figure out if you're really a Lutheran or really a Calvinist. That might be fun to talk about. But the Lutherans say no, it's not the real Jesus doesn't say, "Take and eat, this is my real presence," but "Take and eat, this is my body." And so a reality to the body. Against the Catholic side of the argument of transubstantiation, the Lutherans would say, look, when you try to bring in Aristotle or any sort of philosophy to explain it, you're going too far. You're passing the simple words of Christ. So while the Lutherans, the idea of transubstantiation, which really leans into this Aristotelian distinction between essence and accidents, The Lutherans love that distinction. They talk about it all the time. They're not against that distinction, but they say you don't need that to understand what Jesus is giving. And if you insist on that as doctrine, then you've gone too far.
Mm.
In fact, and that's probably not a Lord's Supper thing, but a how do you do theology thing. The Lutheran argument against the Catholics was always, you cannot bind our conscience to something not taught by the prophets and apostles. So whatever it is that you are insisting on us believing that's not in the apostolic and prophetic scriptures, that's where you've gone too far. And that probably is more of a sola scriptura argument. So while the Lutherans would look at the transubstantiation, they see it not necessarily as bad doctrine on the supper, but just bad theological practice. A lot of people say that Lutherans believe in consubstantiation, but that's what it looks like from the outside. But Lutherans say, look, we're not applying the distinction of essence and accidents to the supper. So we would say, no, it's not consubstantiation. The Lutheran theological language for what happens, like for what is it on the altar, is sacramental union, which is to say, we don't know. In other words, we know that when we point to the bread that's been consecrated, we can say what Jesus said, this is Christ's body. What are you eating in the supper? The true body of Christ. What are you drinking in the supper? The true blood of Christ. And why? For the forgiveness of sins. So that's, I think, a simple view, Lutheran view, in contrast to the others.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I always wondered, I used to say that Lutherans believe in consubstantiation, and then I think it was Megan who was like, no, it's like this different third thing, or I don't know. That's so that's really interesting. It also kind of reminds me of, and I would wonder your thoughts on this. It's a little bit kind of like Eastern Christianity theology where there's some mystery there. Would you say there's like some similarities there? Because it's very emphasized in Eastern theology to lean more into the mystery and that we can't define.
Yes, yes.
Things.
Although I think so, but so I've been trying to figure out, I mean, part of the problem with Orthodoxy is that they just kind of voted present on all of these great debates in Christian history. And so so their mystery is like they are mysteriously inclusive. And and the Lutherans are mysteriously exclusive. So when you're talking to the Orthodox, it's like sometimes they sound like Calvinists, sometimes they sound like Catholics, sometimes they sound like Luther. It's like the only thing they're not is evangelical.
That's yes.
So, and they're like, hey, we're so but the Lutherans, I think, have a little more clarity in saying, well, what it's not. It's not just that. It's not just that. So but we would hopefully embrace mystery in the sense that, you know, that's what the word sacrament is, mysterion, which comes into Latin. That's the Greek, and it comes into Latin as sacramentum. So that there's something wonderful and incomprehensible happening there. But it's not so mysterious that we can't say anything about it. So the Lord wants us to confess the reality of his body and his blood for the benefit of the Christian, specifically the forgiveness of sins.
Yeah.
I'm curious, do Lutherans believe that it's only the consecrated elements that are then the body and blood, or is it just the act of like participating in the sacrament itself? Like, because I know for Catholics, it's very important that a priest consecrates the host. Would that be similar in Lutheranism?
Yeah, similar, different in the sense that the efficacy of the sacrament is not bound to the priest, but to the word. We would limit, though, the consecration and the distribution of the Lord's Supper to the called and ordained pastor. So Article 14 of the Augsburg Confession says we don't permit a man to preach or teach or administer the sacraments unless he's been rightly called. But that's not a question of validity, but of order. In other words, here's how things ought to be, but not how things must be, because I mean, in some ways, the Catholic sacramental system, they'll talk about 7 sacraments, but there's really one. There's kind of a hierarchy of sacraments, maybe 2, and it's baptism and the priesthood, because it's the priesthood that gives the effectiveness to all of the other sacraments, including marriage must be done by a priest, the supper must be consecrated by a priest, extreme unction must be offered by a priest, so that all of the other 5 sacraments kind of fall under the primacy of the indelible character that's given to the priest. This is a crazy thing that my most viewed YouTube video is on the difference between the Lutherans and the Catholics on the Lord's Supper. And I was just looking over that this morning to remember what I used to know about it. And there was a priest who said, well, explain this to me. Explain why when I was ordained, I felt power come from the bishop's hands onto me. And explain why when I consecrate the supper, I feel power leaving my hands and going into the bread and the wine. And so that's pure mysticism. But it also gets to that idea of the sacramental system, is that it has to be the priest to do that. We say, no, it's the word that affects it. So we would say that, and this is because it's bread and wine that's brought to the altar, and then at some point, what we're eating is body and blood. When does that change take place? There is it was a big deal in past generations. It's much less now. A consecrationist versus receptionist argument in the Lutheran Church. In other words, when does it become the body and blood? When it's consecrated or when it's eaten? And there's reasons that both sides are going to present there. But I think the easiest way to say it is when I am up at the altar and I'm consecrating the bread and the wine. When I say, this is my body, the words of Jesus, those words are true. Now it's his body given for us to eat and drink, not to do anything else with. And so we do say that at some point that the bread and the wine that's not eaten or drunk, the Lord would withdraw his body and blood from the elements because he places them there for the purpose of us eating and drinking them. And I think beyond that, we're not able to give a clear, any more information from the scriptures. Did that answer your questions? I think I wandered away from the original questions.
No, you're good. Is it important, like the elements themselves? So, okay, funny story. When I was in Bible school, people argue about this all the time. And we had people at our table in like the dining room. There was like people who were staunchly memorialist, and then people who were more leaning towards like, Calvinistic, Reformed, real presence. And then we had like people who were more leaning towards Lutheran. So it was a very lively debate. And one of the guys who was very, very memorial, he was wanting to go into ministry to be youth pastor. And he was saying like, well, what if I'm on a youth trip and we don't have the elements, but everybody wants to take communion? Like what's wrong with using like Mountain Dew and potato chips for communion? And it like sparked this huge argument. But I think that's something that, in a memorial view, maybe is harder to argue against. But what would be like the Lutheran perspective of why the elements themselves matter, that we use bread and wine or grape juice?
So we have the instituting words of Jesus where he says, do this. So we want to do what he's doing. So taking bread, taking wine, eating it and drinking it. In his memory, so that's part of it. So the memorial meal, I mean, again, we don't want to like be receiving the Lord's body and blood and not remembering him. That's crazy. Yeah. It's interesting to me. So the form of the sacrament, because of the words of Jesus, do this in remembrance of me, become more important with the Lord's Supper than with baptism. And it's interesting that those who have a memorial view of baptism are obsessed with the form. You must be completely dunked or it doesn't count. Mm-hmm. Those who have a memorial view of the supper are like very much less concerned about the form. Like anything you can eat, chew, and anything you can sip, and that's fine. And it's kind of weird because I think the biblical view would be the opposite, that the form of the form of baptism is not that important. It's the water and the word. That's what makes baptism. But the form of the Lord's Supper becomes more important because Jesus is using it to Well, this is true of baptism as well, but he's using it to impress his promise on us so that we can have that confidence. So it's less of a theological approach and more of a pastoral approach in the Lutheran thing is how can we get as close to the words of Jesus, or how can we not stray from the words of Jesus so that we can know that what we're doing is what he said we're doing. So this has to do with questions about, can you use something that's not wine? And the Lutheran answer is really like, no, no. So, I mean, some people have like pressed towards juice and this sort of thing. I think the best practice here is to keep it simple. I just used very diluted wine. So you have wine, but it's very, very, it's great. It's fine. And with the bread too, it's like leavened bread, all this, like, let's get as close as we can to unleavened bread. And we also, just for practicality's sake, if we're really confessing it's a body and blood, let's have a bread that doesn't end up in crumbs all over the place. It's something sort of practical and pastoral so that people can leave the supper and know, yeah, what Jesus wanted me to do, we did. And we can rejoice in that.
Yeah, I actually, for Catholics, you can actually use unleavened or leavened bread. It depends on the culture, which is interesting, but there is a church where they would be used leavened bread and like there were crumbs. And if you believe what Catholics believe about the Eucharist, that is not good. So I'm happy you mentioned that because most churches, I would say, we use leavened bread, unleavened bread, for that reason. But I was curious more about like the difference between Lutheran and Catholic, what the significance of receiving communion is and how that differs from the Catholic understanding. And also, as Catholics, I think also other Protestant traditions would believe that you receive some kind of grace from receiving communion. But I feel like that does look different from tradition to tradition. So, like, what do Lutherans believe that you are receiving when you receive the Lord's Supper?
Yeah, this is so fascinating to me. And it has to do with our conversation last week as well, because you have the scriptures and then you have sort of the theological structure that goes around them. So the Catholic theological structure of union with Christ, growth in charity, the infusion of grace that's empowering a life of faithfulness, kind of really informs, as far as I can tell, the understanding of the benefit of the Lord's Supper. The Lutheran understanding is going to just hone in on the words of institution. So when Jesus says, this is the cup of the New Testament, this is my blood of the New Testament, poured out for you for the forgiveness of sins, the Lutherans are going to hone in on that. And so here's a line from the Small Catechism. What's the benefit of such eating and drinking? Answer: it's shown to us in the words given and shed for you for the remission of sins. Namely that in the sacrament, forgiveness of sins, life and salvation is given through these words. For where there's forgiveness of sins, there is also life and salvation. So the key benefit of the supper is forgiveness. You get that forgiveness, just by the way, by believing the word. So the Lutherans will make this distinction, not a separation, but a distinction that the mouth receives the body and blood and the heart receives the forgiveness of sins. So that's and that eternal benefit. Now the Catholic Church, and I was just from this video that I told you I did, I had dug into the Catholic doctrine. So the Catholic Catechism of the Catholic Church says that there's 8 benefits of the Lord's Supper. So union with Christ, strength, separation from sin, charity in 2 forms, unity with the mystical body, that's the church. It commits us to the poor, and it's a unity feast. What's missing from that list, so curiously, is the forgiveness of sins. And I was thinking about this. And here's one other thing, and I need to go and look at the context of this. But here's a quote from Canon 5 of the Council of Trent. Under the condemnations, if anyone says either that the principal fruit of the Most Holy Eucharist is the remission of sins, or that other effects do not result therefrom, let him be anathema. So the Catholic Church actually anathematizes the idea that the principal fruit of the Eucharist is the forgiveness of sins. And I think it has to do that because of the understanding of justification and the way the forgiveness of sins works and the kind of mediated grace and infused grace of the Catholic system. But I think it's so I don't know, I'm kind of fascinated by that difference. Because while we would look at like transubstantiation versus a body and blood, it's different, but it's not totally different. The sacramental giving of the body and blood of Christ versus the resacrifice of Christ, the unbloody sacrifice of the Mass, that's more different. But then forgiveness of sins versus not mostly forgiveness of sins, that's an amazing difference. And it's amazing to me too that it's just kind of codified that way in the Council of Trent, where Jesus says, "Do this for the forgiveness of sins," and they say, if you think that the forgiveness of sins is the most important part, then you're wrong. Eesh. So that's some of the differences between the Lutherans and the Catholics.
I'm curious, Jackie, for your thoughts, because obviously for Catholics, it's very important that you go to confession before receiving the Eucharist and that you're absolved. So I guess to me, then that would make sense that forgiveness of sins would not be a part of the sacrament because that's already been received, like before even going in. Does that make sense?
It's only required for mortal sins that you go to confession before. And we do believe that every Mass you are forgiven of all venial sins, just a general absolution. And that would be before the reception of the Eucharist. So that does happen every Mass outside of mortal sins. I think because they talk about like a separation from sin, that kind of a little bit hits on like forgiveness of sins in the Eucharist, but I would have to look into that more because I do know that the Mass, there is an absolution and forgiveness of sins like wrapped into the Mass. But I would have to look into that more because I would agree that in my education of the Eucharist, it's never been emphasized like that the forgiveness of sins is in the actual receiving of the Eucharist. I know that you receive more grace that separates you from sin. And then obviously just receiving the body of Christ and then all the grace is wrapped in that. But yeah, I do know that it's usually emphasized like our disposition before we receive the Eucharist.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so this gets into a bunch of differences, like the difference between intention and faith, and and again, like the whole sacrificial system, the idea that the Lord's Supper is a sacrifice, a propitiatory sacrifice. So that's also the language of the Council of Trent, and it kind of like, so my Lutheran sensibilities go like, whoa, so that the sacrifice. This is Trent chapter 2. The sacrifice is truly propitiatory, in that by means thereof this is effected, that we obtain mercy and find grace and seasonable aid. If anyone says that it's not, if the sacrifice of the Mass is not a propitiatory sacrifice, let him be anathema. So that the idea that the propitiatory is that the theological word of appeasing wrath, so that here comes the wrath of God, and the sacrifice stands between the wrath of God and us. And that's what Jesus did on the cross. And we would make this distinction that it is the cross and the cross alone that is the propitiatory sacrifice of all time. And then the Lord delivers to us the fruit or the benefit of that sacrifice in the supper. So that it's not a sacrifice, but it's a distribution of the benefit of the sacrifice. So here's an old Lutheran distinction, which I think is marvelous. It's one of the first things I learned about the Lutherans, and it's like it's probably the first thing I learned and the last thing I'll teach. It comes from I'll quote Luther in a beautiful little essay called "Against the Heavenly Prophets." So this is Luther talking mostly about the Anabaptists and the evangelicals, but it applies both ways. He says, we have to make a distinction between the winning of forgiveness and the distribution of forgiveness. Christ won the forgiveness of sins once for all by his death on the cross, but he distributes that forgiveness throughout the world through the word and the sacraments. In the Old Testament, it was the word and the sacraments of, now it's me. This is me, not Luther, but the idea, it was the word and the circumcision and the sacrificial system of the temple. In the New Testament, it's the word and baptism and the Lord's Supper. That's how the forgiveness of sins is distributed. It's not the winning, but the distributing. So then that stands as sort of a touchstone to bring a critique in both directions. We would say that the evangelical error is seeing that the forgiveness of sins is distributed on the cross. So this is the tradition of at the foot of the cross. I go to the foot of the cross. In fact, the memorial meal is that my mind is carrying me back to the cross where I'm going to get benefit from being there. Well, there's actually no benefit from being at the foot of the cross. There was all these soldiers there. Can you imagine this? The soldiers were under Jesus, and one of them becomes a Christian. God be praised. But the rest of them are still pagan Roman soldiers, and they would have gone home from crucifixion duty, and their uniforms would have been covered with the blood of Jesus, and they had no benefit. I mean, their wives are like, crucifixion again today. This is such a mess. I have to clean up all this stuff. They literally had the blood of Jesus on them, and no benefit. So that we say, no, the cross is the winning of forgiveness, but not the distribution point. The Catholics, on the other hand, want to go to the sacraments, which we understand as distribution, and say, no, that is actually the winning of forgiveness, the accomplishing of mercy. It's a propitiatory sacrifice. And we say, no, that's also making a mistake. It was once for all, one sacrifice, appeased the wrath of God for all time, for all people in his death on the cross. And now it comes to you, really comes to you, in the promise of forgiveness that's brought to us in the sacraments. So we would say to the evangelicals, you confuse the winning with distribution, and to the Catholics, you confuse the distribution with the winning, and that would kind of then define the Lutheran way of thinking about the connection between the death of Jesus on the cross and baptism and absolution and the Lord's Supper. So I suppose even to go back to our baptism conversation, the Baptists and evangelicals want to say baptism can't save because it's a work and it's not the cross. We'll say, right, but baptism is what brings the cross to you. And the same with the Lord's Supper. They'd say, well, the Lord's Supper can't save because Jesus, his death on the cross is what saved. We say, right, his death on the cross won it, and Jesus sets it up so that you can have it, so that the forgiveness can be delivered to you. And why we say baptism and the Lord's Supper saves and forgives, well, because Jesus promised they would, but it's bringing that, it's not disconnected from the cross like a separate thing. It is the cross being brought to you in the way that the Lord is determined to bring it to you.
I don't know if you use this language, but I will make one clarification is that Catholics don't believe it's a resacrifice. We're like very against that language, and that it's going back outside of time to that one sacrifice, that we don't sacrifice Christ over and over again.
Yes. Yeah, if I did say that, I'm sorry. I'm normally
I don't know
carefully
if you did. I just know that's one critique that we get a lot. Like, oh, you guys sacrifice Christ every single mass. It's like, no. Yeah, it's like going back to that one. So I just want to say that we agree more than it seems like, because it's not like we're re-sacrificing Christ. It's like we are going back to that one crucifixion that happened, and it's outside of time and connecting to that and receiving the graces from that. But I don't know. Yeah, I know that there's a lot of like technical differences there.
I've tried on this, Jackie, to figure out what the doctrine of the sacrifice of the Mass is. Every priest and Catholic theologian that I talk to, this is what I say. Hey, can you explain your doctrine of sacrifice? And they say, no. Because I don't, because it is I think it's very complicated in the sense that, and especially when you try to compare what was said at Trent versus what was said at Vatican II, it's difficult to sync those up, but of necessity in the Catholic mind, they have to sync somehow. But I think it's difficult to sync them up. The big thing is there's an interesting line in Trent. This is my problem, is like I'm still arguing against like Tridentine Catholicism, and there's like 7 of you, that like, well, I shouldn't say that. There's more Tridentine Catholic, but they're like, yeah, you're not really arguing against us. But there's a line in Trent that says that if anyone denies that the words "do this in remembrance of me" institute a New Testament priesthood like the Levitical priesthood, let him be anathema. In other words, "do this in remembrance of me" become the words of institution for a New Testament priesthood. And the priest then has the duty of offering a sacrifice. So that sacrifice is the sacrifice of the Mass. It's the unbloody sacrifice. So it's not a re-crucifixion of Christ, but it is a representation, I think, of Christ to the Father. But here would be where I think the Lutherans would come and say, okay, who is the chief actor in this sacrifice? Because the one who's working in a sacrifice is the priest who's giving the offering. And we would say, hey, the one who's operating in the supper is Jesus. He's the one who's there to serve. And so he's not, he is the sacrifice, but he is also the host who gives himself to us. And so it's not chiefly the act of the priest or the act of the church, the kind of this kind of, also this idea that the laity themselves are involved in the sacrifice. We would say that Christ is present, serving us with his body and his blood, and giving us the forgiveness of sins. So that the chief action is not the action of the church or the priesthood to offer the sacrifice, but the action of Jesus to come to us, to be with us, and to bless us with his body and his blood. So I think that's that emphasis on who's the chief actor is another place where there's a difference. I don't know. Jackie, does that resonate with you, or you're like, no, it's Jesus who comes to?
I do know that Catholics, we give more, there's more of a power in the priest. I guess you would say more of a focus on the priesthood versus in Protestantism, for sure. So I want to say that sounds right to me. But like I said, not being a theologian, I don't want to misspeak, but I do know that there is more of an emphasis on the priest doing it versus probably in other traditions, like from what you're saying, from the Lutheran tradition.
Jackie, do you remember the work retreat we went on where that priest, this was like a funny moment. So I used to work at a Catholic organization with Jackie, so we'd have lots of moments where I was like appalled and shocked by things. But during one of the presentations, the priest said that Jesus obeys the priest in the sacrament. So Jesus humbles himself and obeys the priest. I was thinking about that. And I was like, I had like such a huge problem with it. But that's maybe sort of like speaking to that element of like the role that the priest is playing.
I will say that it's not based on the faith of the priest or the priest. He's just saying the words, and because he's been given that sacrament, he's in that role. Because there's this famous story which I think is just so cool, and I think can point to, it's going to be interesting, but there was a priest in Italy, I think, who was very much doubting that he was a priest, he was consecrated, he was saying the words, whatever, but he was very much doubting that the Eucharist actually turned into the body and blood of Christ. And the Eucharist turned into blood, actually, and they still have, and into flesh, and they still have, it hasn't like disappeared or it's actual flesh, and it's a piece of a heart, and then the blood type. And it's happened a couple other times, and they're all the same type of blood type and whatever. I'll post the link to, like, it's a Eucharistic miracle, whatever, but that just shows that it's not really based on the disposition of the priest and his faith in what he's saying or doing. He's just doing, like, going through the words, but it really is like God's power. And I also think that God can withhold his presence in some ways too, So I don't think that the church would agree that God is obeying what the priest is saying, and that the power is fully in what the priest is doing. Um, if that makes sense. Because that also, he said that, and I was like, I don't like that. I don't think that sounds right. But I should look into that. I don't know if any of that sounds similar to Lutheranism or different. I don't know.
We don't have the tradition of Eucharistic miracles, and we'd probably be against them because I mean, not that God can't do miracles and doesn't do miracles, but the point of the supper is to strengthen faith, that we would walk by faith and not by sight. And the point of a miracle, I think, is to strengthen sight. You see it. The problem is strengthening sight does not, it works the opposite. I mean, when when Abraham says, this is Jesus' parable of the rich man and Lazarus, and there's the rich man asking Abraham to send Lazarus back from the dead. And he says, look, if they have Moses and the prophets, let them believe them. If they don't believe them, they won't believe even if someone rises from the dead. And so we want to base our faith on the words of Moses and the prophets and the apostles. And if you don't believe them, the miracle's not gonna help. So the whole tradition of Eucharistic miracles, it also kind of chafes against the Lutherans. It's like, hey, yeah, we knew it was the body and blood. Like what? Like why are you like? So here's a crying statue, or here's a bleeding host, or whatever. We're like, Jesus said it's his body and blood. What's the problem? Like, why is this So the kind of the piety of the Lutherans just sort of chafes against that. We would say that, this goes back to the Donatist controversy of, does the personal faith of the pastor or the priest have anything to do with the validity of their sacramental actions? And this was a big deal during times of persecution, because if a priest renounced Christ during a time of persecution, then like the people that he married and the people he baptized are like, well, am I really? And they said, and Donatus said no, and St. Augustine said yes, because it's not based on the faith of the priest, but the words of the priest. So the authority belongs to the word, and the office has authority because it belongs to the word. So, and this is an interesting thing to think of, that the Lutherans, so the Catholic Church has the doctrine of the priesthood, and so that the pastors are priests, and there's various different offices and orders under that system. Evangelicals have not really, there's no real priesthood there. Maybe it's the priesthood of all believers. Every Christian is a priest. The Lutherans would talk about the priesthood of all believers, and also have a high view of the office, but we wouldn't call the pastor the priest, because he's not there to offer sacrifices. He's rather there to preach and administer the sacraments. So it's a high view of the office, but it's not a priestly office. So my office as a pastor, my office as a Christian, a baptized Christian, is a priestly office, but my office as a pastor is not a priestly office. I'm not here to offer a sacrifice, but rather to distribute the gifts that Jesus wants distributed.
Curious too, I feel like another distinction between maybe the Lutheran view and the Catholic view comes to like adoration. So Catholics adoring the elements after the sacrament has taken place, whereas I believe Lutherans would be against that. Would you mind speaking to that?
Sure. Yeah, sure. That's great. So I think it goes back to the words as well. So when the early Lutherans are writing against like the Corpus Christi processions, parades, and the adoration, they said, look, Jesus did not say take and march or take and adore. If he did say that, we would do it. But what he said was take and eat and take and drink. So in the very earliest traditions of the Lutheran Church, and I think this is a good tradition, and it's been a little bit lost, but I think it's starting to come back, and that is that everything that's consecrated for every service is consumed and drunk, so that there's no reliquy, there's no remaining body and blood. There's no remaining bread and wine. And simply why? Because Jesus said, take and eat and take and drink. And he didn't command us to take and do anything else. And he didn't, so that if we move past that, if we move past the taking and eating, then we don't have a word of God, and so we can't be sure if what we're doing is right and good and helpful and so forth. There is an adoration in the Lutheran tradition, and you see it in two ways. First, for the pastor who consecrates, after the words are spoken, he'll genuflect. This is, again, is early Lutheran tradition that's been lost, but I think it's coming back. Also, most of the time when Lutherans come to receive the Lord's Supper, they'll also kneel, and so that kneeling is an act of adoration. But it's connected to the taking and eating and drinking. So it's confessing. So, for example, when I am consecrating the supper, I'll chant or speak, but mostly chant the words of institution over the bread, the body, and then I will kneel and genuflect before it, and then to the blood, to the wine that's there, speak or chant the words of institution over the blood, and then genuflect, and then lift up. So there's the lifting there as part of the for the pacts. The peace of the Lord be with you always. So hold up the body and the blood and give the blessing, the pacts. And so there's that. That is the Lutheran adoration, but it's minimal, and especially from the Catholic tradition, it's probably maximal from the evangelical tradition. Like, what are you doing? But from the Catholic tradition, it's minimal, and I think it's minimal for a reason, because it's connected to the eating and drinking, and it's trying to constrain what we think we ought to do with the body and blood to what Jesus thinks we ought to do with the body and the blood. So it's kind of a back to the words, so that we can, and you see here that kind of, I hope you see the kind of Lutheran theological instinct is that we have the words of Jesus, and if we try to build with our own thinking off of those words, we start to wander into dangerous territory. So back to the words, let's confess the words, rejoice in the words, and not try to stray too far from them. So that's the Lutherans would say to the, and this, by the way, is this was the issue that first spun me out of evangelicalism, was the Lord's Supper. I remember we were at a service, a Thursday night service at a Calvary Chapel in Albuquerque, and the preacher was preaching about, who knows, kind of verse by verse, going through the book of Acts or something. I don't remember. And he was talking about how we read the Bible. He says, we read the Bible seriously. We read the Bible carefully. We read the Bible literally. And I said, great. And then through the lesson was over, and he says, well, tonight we're going to have the Lord's Supper. And they had bread and wine or juice, the individual, like little snap tops or whatever, who knows. And he says, Jesus says, why are we doing this? Because Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. Take and eat, this is my body. Take and drink, this is my blood. But we don't take those words literally. And this was just after a thing where he says, we take the word literally. And then he says, but not these words. And I said, well, why not? Why not take these words literally? Are there people who take these words literally? And so for the evangelicals, the Lutherans say, hey, look at these words. This is my body. This is my blood. And then to the Catholics, the Lutherans say, now look at these words, poured out for you for the forgiveness of sins. And I think I think that maybe this, I don't know if this is too bold, but it seems to me that that's why the Lord still has the Lutherans around, is to kind of say to everybody, hey, well, look at these words. And then over here, hey, well, look at these words, to call back, because we sort of build our systems up this way. And we're not impervious to that, to kind of building systems of doctrine. So we have to be careful, but to call the church back to, hey, well, what does Jesus want me to have? So when I go to the supper, well, number one, I ought to go to the supper. It's because Jesus said, do it often. Okay, I ought to go to the supper. What does Jesus want to give me in the supper? Well, what he says is, this is my body and blood to take and eat. Why does he want to give it to me? For the forgiveness of sins. And I can know that. And with that confidence, I can fight the devil, who wants to tell me constantly that Jesus has abandoned me, that Jesus has forgotten me, that God is mad at me because of my sins, that judgment day is a horror, that I won't make it into heaven. No, I have this confidence that Jesus loves me this much that he puts down this pledge of his body and blood to the promise of the forgiveness of sins. And now I'm founded on the rock. Now I'm locked in to that confidence that the Lord wants me to have.
I'm curious. So one aspect of Lutheran theology that I've struggled with is a closed table.
Yeah.
And coming from an evangelical background, I think that makes sense. I've only ever been to churches with an open table where the only requirement was that you were a Christian. And so that was something, becoming friends with Jackie, I constantly ribbed on her about the fact that if I went to Mass with her, I couldn't partake in communion because I didn't have this correct belief in transubstantiation. And I felt that having correct belief was not a requirement for the table. It is faith. And obviously, I don't know, I'm still wrestling through that. But what is the Lutheran understanding of a closed table? I guess, obviously it would be different than Catholicism because it's not that you're not under the Pope or something, but there is a closed table.
Yeah. So I mentioned that the body and blood was the reason we kind of spun out of evangelicalism. Closed communion was the last hurdle to come into the Lutheran Church because it was so difficult for us. I mean, how can you tell me that I can't do this thing? Because evangelicalism is very individualistic. It's me and God, and there's really no sense of unity of doctrine. So I think maybe three things for the supper. Well, let's just do two. And if people are interested, I tried to simplify the argument for closed communion, the biblical argument for closed communion, just kind of laid it out on a web page, and I think it's wolfmeuller.co/closed communion or something. If you just search for that in my name, that'll come up. But there's two things about the supper. Number one, Paul warns about unworthy communion and those who have eaten and drunk judgment on themselves. And so there is a care that's taken in the distribution of the Lord's Supper, a pastoral care so that people do not unknowingly eat or drink judgment on themselves. This is one pastor said that the pastor is a pharmacist, not a drug dealer. It's not just you'll give it to anybody who wants it. There's an actual care in the distribution. But that's not yet closed communion. That's pastoral care and worthy communion. Closed communion is something different. And it's saying that there's two things that are happening in the supper, at least. The first is that Jesus is dishing out to his people the forgiveness of sins. And that's the main thing that's happening in the supper. God be praised. But there's a second thing that's happening in the supper, and that is that the church is united in their confession. So we see this like in Acts 2, where they devoted themselves to the apostles' doctrine and the breaking of bread, especially in 1 Corinthians 10 and 11, where Paul talks about the communion at the altar of demons, communion at the altar of the Lord, and this sort of thing. And so this is what the Catholic Church has is the eighth benefit, is that the sacrament is the sacrament of union of the church. And I think that's right. In other words, that part of coming to the supper is saying with all those who are there with us that we agree, that we confess the same thing. So there's a unity of faith that is expressed in the unity of the supper. Now, we know that the Lord wants us to be of one mind. He wants us to have a unity of faith. And that we should, like, for example, Paul says, mark those who cause divisions and avoid them. But how does that marking and avoiding happen? So everybody has a closed something, like a way to distinguish those who confess what we believe with those who do not confess what we believe. But maybe like the evangelical, it's church membership, or I don't know how that's expressed. But we have this understanding that the place that inclusion or exclusion happens is at the supper. And it's hard because we're so individualistic. It's hard because we don't understand the altar as a place of confession. But Paul says, whoever eats this bread and drinks this blood, whoever eats this bread and drinks this cup, proclaims the Lord's death until he comes. So the act of going to the Lord's Supper is not just an act of receiving the gifts, but also proclaiming Christ. And that we want to be proclaiming the same thing. So that's where that unity is, we understand that unity is expressed. The easiest way, I think, to explain it is if I came up, we're all walking around at the mall or something, and some Greenpeace activist comes up and says, "Hey, would you sign this petition?" And I say, "Well, what's it about?" And they say, "Well, never mind. Why did you just sign it? Everyone's doing it." And I'm like, "Well, no, I want to read it to make sure that I agree with it." And it's like, "Nah, it's not that important." I'm like, "No, I'm not going to." So that's it. The altar in the ancient world, the altar is that. It's a confession of something. And are you going to put your name on it or not? So you would never put your name on a petition that you don't agree with. So you would never put your name on an altar that you don't share with the confession. So it should be that close communion should be the other way. It shouldn't be like, no, you can't come. It should be like, I'm not part of that. But because we've kind of lost that sensibility in worship, and we're like, it's just me and Jesus. Now the church has to some ways guard it. Like, hey, it's almost like we go to the mall and we're just looking for petitions to sign, and the Greenpeace activist has to say, well, you should read it and agree with it first. In other words, it's kind of flipped. And so we have to say, no, you need to understand and see, can you confess with us, yes or no? And then let's do that before communion. So if someone's not in communion fellowship with us, we don't say that they're not a Christian or not saved or not part of the Lord's church. What we're saying is, because we don't have the same confession, we need to continue to pray and work and study together so that we can confess together and then commune together. So that's the basic idea. I don't know if that makes sense or.
Yeah, I think that does help. I think I am a little bit trapped in like the individualistic evangelical perspective. I guess it kind of goes back to a little element of what we were talking about last time in the baptism episode of like theological minimalism of like what's the lowest common denominator that we can accept. And I think I've just always struggled with denying someone the sacrament if they are desiring to partake in it. Maybe even if they don't like agree or understand. In my mind, I'm like, yes, like let them come forward. Like they are desiring this, they want this, like they will receive those benefits, and that's what I want. Like, who am I to deny that? And so I think it's like a different sort of framework that I have to put my mind into.
So I try to announce it every Sunday, something like this. We have the supper today. Jesus is our host in our meal. He gives us his body and blood for the forgiveness of sins. It's his desire and it's our desire that all people commune with him and us at his altar. But we do believe that unity of faith and doctrine comes before unity in the Lord's Supper. So if you're not a member, talk with the pastor. In other words, yes, we're on the way to the altar. Everybody's on the way to the altar, and communing together is a good thing. But there's just things that need to happen beforehand. I mean, I suppose a kind of crude analogy would be intimacy between husband and wife. Like that's a great thing, but you got to be married first. And so what would be unauthorized before marriage is a good work. It's a sin before marriage. It's a good work after marriage. So what changed? Like we love each other just the same today as we do tomorrow, right? Well, what changed is you were declared to be husband and wife. There was a public declaration of who you are. So something like that happens like at confirmation, which is a man-made tradition. It's not biblical. But it's a point where we say, hey, I'm standing up and saying, yes, this altar is my altar. This confession is my confession. And now coming to the supper is a good work. So that public declaration really does change things. So I think that's again, a crude analogy, but I maybe that's helpful.
Yeah.
I'm assuming then that Lutherans are not allowed to receive at other churches. Say they visit a Catholic church one weekend or an evangelical church, that they wouldn't be from their end supposed to participate in communion at that church as well, because that's how it works for Catholics. Like
Yep.
I'm not to receive if I were to go to a Lutheran church, or to Megan's church, which they would say that I could, I would say no, I cannot,
Right.
kind of thing. So
Yep, same
Yeah.
exact idea. And so Lutherans are listening, you should know that, because this is something that's for some reason it's not that well known. It's like, well, they can't commune with us, but sure we can commune with. No. It's so the same thing. It applies. So we go to church, visit your friends' churches. This is really great, but the act of communion is an act of theological fellowship. So you don't pretend like you have fellowship with people that you don't have fellowship with. So we don't commune with other churches. That's exactly right.
Just like you wouldn't be baptized at a different church.
That's right. I remember my wife one time taught piano. This is an interesting thing. She was teaching piano lessons at a Methodist church. This is when we were at seminary in Fort Wayne, and they had a kind of music conservatory or something. And so I went to pick her up. They had a sign on the front, and it said, "We are a welcoming church. Everyone can come and commune here, no matter what." It had all the diversity lists there. Everyone's welcome. And then, if you're interested in joining after a time of instruction, you can be baptized. And I said, no, wait a minute. They practice open communion and closed baptism. That's exactly the opposite. No, we just say baptism is wide open. You're ready. You confess the creed. You believe in Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Time for baptism. Let's go. And then after a time of instruction, and you're ready to confess the catechism, the basics of the faith, then let's join it at the supper. So it's just exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
I have one more question that I just thought of. What is the Lutheran perspective on the importance of taking communion in both kinds? So both the bread and the wine every time you do communion, because I know that's a difference too with Catholicism is it's not necessarily required that you take in both kinds. I know most masses I've attended, people have only taken the bread, and which was surprising to me, even from an evangelical background. You would never just do one, not the other. What's sort of the Lutheran perspective on that?
Yeah. So again, it's this kind of instinct. Well, what is Jesus giving? And Jesus says, "Take and eat. This is my body. Take and drink. This is the blood of the New Testament, poured out for you for the forgiveness of sins." So Jesus is giving us his body and his blood to eat and to drink. It's interesting that at the time of the Reformation, that change happened very slowly, though. So that they were all communing in one kind, and it was a matter of years, probably 3 years before the communion. They were theologically ready for communion in both kinds, but they didn't institute it for a while. And that was a big political fight too. Like you would get, like the way that the Catholic priests or the Catholic princes would distinguish their region from the others is communion in one kind versus not. It's interesting to think about. Because so it's again this thing. Well, what does Jesus give? And then when I go to church, what do I get? And is there a gap between what Jesus wants to give and what the church is offering? That's going to be the problem. And we say, well, Jesus wants to give his body and his blood for the forgiveness of sin. So if I'm not getting that, why not? It's a curious thing to look at the origin of the distribution in one kind. I think there were practical things. I think it probably started as practical, and then the Catholic Church developed a theology around it, the theology of concomitance, which says that because it's the living body of Jesus, it also includes blood because a living body has blood in it, and therefore when you get the bread, you're also getting the blood, and et cetera, et cetera. But again, the Lutherans are like, what are you doing? What I mean, why are you? I mean, it's pretty clear what Jesus says: take and eat, take and drink. So you're kind of building up a system. So I don't know. I think the Catholic Church in Vatican II, it goes back to distribution in both kinds, and so it makes that a possibility for the laity. So I think even the Catholic Church would say, yeah, that's what Jesus says: take and eat, take and drink, and we don't want to withhold the blood from the laity also. So I think there's agreement now with everybody on that, but it took the Catholic Church like 1,000 years to kind of come around on that. So I think that's the Lutheran answer. Is it's like we're trying to pay attention to what Jesus is giving, and we want to get what he's giving. That's the main point. We want to make sure that we're picking up what he's putting down. I'm interested in Jackie's thoughts on that, though, on the both kinds, one kind.
I definitely veer more toward I'm Catholic, so I agree with the Catholic view, but that it just doesn't matter if you receive both or you receive just the blood or you receive the body, that it all is the Eucharist, and it is kind of like receiving one or the other. It's not like they're separate. It's all a part of receiving Jesus and his body. So I veer toward that you can receive one or the other, and they're both the Eucharist. And I know it's different from culture to culture, like church. I think like the church has it can give out both or just one. There's no, should I say, like dogma around that. So every church I go to is different. Yeah, I grew up always just receiving the Eucharist. The blood wasn't offered at every Mass, and it wasn't until I came to Chicago. It's interesting, like different communities or cities, it's very different. When COVID happened and they stopped having the blood at every Mass and it was just the host, it was a whole uproar. And I was like, I'm always kind of just used to receiving the host. So for me, I think I just agree with the Catholic view that you can do either, and it's the fullness of the Eucharist, and that it's not really a issue. But I have some friends that are very much like, no, I want to receive the blood in the body every time I go, if it's there. And I will only go to a church where it's both are there. But yeah, it's different community to community and even country to country. It's more of like a tradition thing versus a doctrine issue for us, I think. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you. That's helpful.
I don't know if Megan has any. It's never been an issue for me. I'm like, I'll receive either. I'll receive, yeah. So it just depends.
Yeah, I just never experienced having them separated. They were always together.
It's always, I mean, at the Mass, there's always both are consecrated, obviously. It's just sometimes the priest will be the only one to drink the blood, or the other person that's up there with him will also, that's giving out communion, like the other priest or extraordinary minister. But every Mass, there's always both, I should say, are consecrated, the host, the bread and the wine. But
distributed, I should say. Like,
yes, yeah, I should clarify that if someone's not been to a Catholic Mass.
It's interesting too. Yeah. So we would say that the thing that is received is the body and blood of Jesus. The benefit is by faith, but that I think the act itself. So here's another difference between the Lutherans and the Catholics, is that the idea of the Mass working ex opere operato, so in the working of the work having that own benefit, and that you can participate in that benefit by intention, or that the benefit of it can be transferred. Like, for example, that you can say a Mass for the dead, and that the benefit of that Mass could be transferred to a person who's dead, is also completely foreign to the Lutheran way of thinking. So that you're coming to eat and to drink, and in the eating and drinking, you're believing the words "given and shed for you for the forgiveness of sins," and in that believing, you have the benefit. So that's a big difference. And this is, I think, a funny story that we ought to talk about, at least to throw in here for this crypto Calvinist controversy, is when there was all these kind of secret Calvinists kind of sneaking in with the Lutherans, and they were trying to figure out what the difference is. And so they would ask, well, what does the unbeliever get when they come to the Lord's Supper? And so they came up with this question that was called the manducatio indignorum. I just love that. The manducating of the indignant, or the eating of the unbeliever. What does the unbeliever get when they come to the Lord's Supper? And the Calvinists would say they get bread and wine, because it's by faith that they participate in the divine nature, that they ascend into heaven and have communion with the body and blood. And the Lutherans would say, no, it's the body and the blood. The unbeliever gets the body and the blood, but not the benefit of forgiveness of sins. Rather, they get judgment. So that the body and blood is truly there, no matter what you believe. But the benefit is, so the body and blood is given into your mouth. The benefit is given into your ears and hearts through the word, the forgiveness of sins. So I can be an unbeliever, can come, can take it, and it ends up being to my own judgment because I'm rejecting the promise, etc. So that was that kind of fun question that helps clarify, like, what's the distinction between the Lutherans and the Reformed on this question?
Yeah.
Well, we would agree that if you're not a believer, that you wouldn't receive benefit from it. You have to believe to actually receive the grace, even if someone is offering that for you. And the offering for the dead, I think that distinction comes in because of our differences between purgatory, that, those can only be offered or benefit souls that are in purgatory, which are believers. So that's a whole other theological difference that could take up like another 3 hours to talk about.
I'll let you guys argue about that one, and if you need help, let me know.
I think we did do an episode on purgatory.
Yeah,
on purgatory. I mean, of course, that episode that was just like a intro.
Us chatting.
I mean, we could talk about that for. There's a lot.
No, we covered everything.
Oh,
we covered the entire.
Yeah, we covered everything there was to cover. I said everything perfectly right. Yeah.
There's a long section in Martin Chemnitz's examination of the Council of Trent. This is kind of the Lutheran response to Trent, big, massive thing, and he talks about all the visions that undergirded the doctrine of purgatory, even going back to Augustine.
Yeah,
it's an amazing thing to see. It's fascinating to me.
Yeah, that's a whole thing.
Those are all the questions I can think of. Jackie, do you have anything else?
Oh, well, of course. I could talk about this for hours, but nothing that I'm prepared to talk about. I have things I want to think about and questions, but
Well,
I
think this is really interesting.
Guys, like having this conversation, and the way that you guys are doing this is great. And even though, Jackie, you're Ireland jet lagged, and Megan, you're recovering, and you guys are like, we're going to wake up on Saturday morning and we're going to talk about theology. It's so cool. So God be praised for you guys. It's really wonderful. So, and thanks for letting me be part of it. It's so cool.
Thank you for taking time out of your day to talk. Yeah. I think it's been really helpful for me, even just personally, to hear these distinctions and to sort of walk through it very clearly and concisely. I think that's super helpful for me. And I know a lot of our audience enjoys it as well. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Some of the quotes that I mentioned, I showed again this YouTube video that I did years ago about the differences. All those quotes were in there, and so they're hanging around too. So we can maybe get.
I'll probably just link it then.
Yeah. I should do a video about the difference between the Lutherans and the Baptists, but it's not as complicated there, because we're like, it's the body, and the Catholics not the body. We're like, it forgives sins. That doesn't do that either. So that's kind of simple.
I think this is a great distinction too, because I think a lot of Catholics think that all Protestants believe in that hard memorial view. And that was something true. I think I just assumed as well. And or I thought it was just memorial consubstantiation, because I had met Anglicans and talked with them, and then transubstantiation. And that, oh no, there's a lot of views in between memorial and transubstantiation. So I think it's really good to hear that fleshed out a bit more and to understand that. Because I thought all Protestants just thought it was completely a symbol for a while there. I was raised with around pretty much only Catholics and then only memorial viewing Protestants. So
I always do a chart. It's body, blood, bread, wine, and then Baptists, Reformed, Lutherans, Catholics. And so Baptists, no body and blood, only bread and juice. That's the memorial meal. And then no Calvinists, they have no body and blood. Instead, it's the divine presence of Christ, and they've got bread and wine. And then there's the Catholics. They don't even have bread and wine. It all turned to body and blood. The essence is now transformed. And then you got the Lutherans, body, blood, bread, wine. And the slogan is, become Lutheran. We've got it all. This is the...
Yeah, my
Oh
first
gosh.
experience with a Protestant talking about the supper, I wasn't even trying, but I think he wasn't used to Catholics being around. And he was like talking about I don't know which verse or something. And um, he's like, yeah, it's so funny how Jesus said, do this and remember me, not some stupid ritual thing like the Catholics. And I was like, oh, well, so that was my first impression of what
Nice
Protestants
to meet
think.
you.
Yeah, I was like, oh, and he was like, oh, no offense though. I'm like, kind of offended since that's like the source and summit of my entire faith and I would die for it. So a little offended, but
Well, it's an amazing. It is an amazing thing to think about. Like the words are so clear. This is my body. This is my blood. What is it in the evangelical mind that just can't have it? Like that can't be the case. Because the evangelical can look at the miracle of the incarnation and say, well, there's the divine Son of God in the body, in a human body, joined together forever. So they don't deny the miracle of the personal union, but the miracle of the sacramental union they deny.
Hmm.
And we would say that the thing that is creeping in there is just rationalism. It's a little bit of
Yeah.
rationalism that creeps into evangelicalism that says that it doesn't make sense. And then you get the arguments like, well, Jesus said, I am the vine, but he wasn't literally vine. Well,
I'm the door.
he didn't say this vine is my body. I mean, it's a very, very different thing.
Hmm,
So,
yeah.
so the rationalism enters in there. And I think that rationalism is motivated by a slight Gnosticism. We talked about this last week, that for the
Yeah.
evangelical and the Baptist, the theater of divine activity is internal. It's in the heart. And
Hmm.
if anything is external, then it's law. That would be the law, but it's understood as either ritual or works or something like that.
Hmm.
If it's outside of me, it can't be salvific. So because the saving thing comes again in my internal traveling back to the crucifixion or whatever, the internal spiritual benefit. So there's an instinct to diminish the words, this is my body, and for the forgiveness of sins. Because that if going to the supper forgives sins, it feels like a work to the
Hmm.
evangelical. So the same with baptism, because it's external, because it's an activity, it feels like works-based salvation. So the theological structure is then trying to make sense of the words, and the memorial meal is what you come up with, or the real presence. That I think that's the way it works. So
Yeah, I think I do see a little bit of that resistance to, which is funny because it's to me it's participation, not so much a work. And they're very much big into participation when it comes to worship or reading your Bible, like personal devotion, those kind of things. Those aren't seen as works, but
Hmm.
the sacraments are for some reason.
isn't it interesting? It's because worship and the personal devotion requires an intensity of internal attention.
Mm.
And that is bound up to the idea of faith. Whereas you can eat and drink something without even really knowing what you're doing. And so it doesn't count.
Hmm.
You could also be dunked in water without paying attention to what you're doing. So it doesn't count, because what really counts is that the internal experience. And the Catholics will veer towards that too with their intention and all that kind of stuff. But it's bad for the evangelicals because there's nothing outside, it's all inside. So the reason why you can make the Lord's Supper actually benefit is not that you go and take the Lord's Supper, but you have this experience of remembering. And it's really the experience of remembering, of being touched by God, of feeling close to God. That's the sacramental life of the evangelical. And so this is why the praise service and the worship is the sacraments, because it's moving me to that internal experience of the nearness of God. So that
Mhm.
it's been moved, the locus has been moved from external to internal. And that's the
I wonder if
basic
too there's
mystical thing.
a bit of anti-Catholic impulse in a lot of evangelical movements as well. Because I remember like a pushback I often heard was against having communion every week. A lot of low church, like Baptists, will have communion monthly. And when I would push on that and say, why not have it weekly every Sunday? They would be like, oh, we don't want it to turn into like a ritual or just like a thing we do, you know, we really want it to be intentional. But they're completely fine with like worship every Sunday, a sermon every Sunday. But are those things turning into ritual or just something we do? I always find that interesting. And part of me wonders if there is just like a push against anything that looks or feels like Catholicism.
Yeah. Concur.
Oh, I'm sure. We have that on our end too. If there's any bit of like praise and worship type music in mass, like, that's Protestant. We can't have that.
People get upset.
Some people, yeah. Which it's not my preference, but I don't think it's sinful or bad.
Well, I'm
yeah,
sure we could
thank
talk
you
about
so
this
much.
for hours and hours, but
I know.
Well, yeah, again, thank you guys for having me. This is great. And as you guys keep going up, you'll be in my prayers. I hope to keep in touch as well. And if things come up and we can do this again, whatever is wonderful.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
just let
for
me know
sure.
and you guys keep in touch. And to everyone listening
Yeah.
and all the YouTube theologians out there, I hope this has
Yeah.
been helpful to you. It's great.
Yeah.